I had to pick these topics, it feels like a long time ago already. And I had one particular idea that I definitely wanted to share with you. And I figured the rest would all flow when I came to putting it together. And I was kind of thinking it was going to be a feel good session. I actually was wondering if it even could be a connection to Mother's Day, but I did it actually so long ago, and always thought Mother's Day is like at the end of May. So I thought, oh, well, we're going to miss it anyway. So it doesn't really matter, if it's this week or next week or whatever. And then recently, of course, I've realized that Mother's Day is sooner than we think, not this weekend, but the next, I think. And so that maybe I should have put it next weekend as a kind of tie into Mother's Day. But then as I got deeper into the text that I thought would be the most interesting for us to look at, I got happier and happier that I did not tie it into Mother's Day, because I'm hoping that we're going to find inspiration, but it's not the kind of like a Hallmark card, bouquet of flowers, kind of fluffy kind of things about mothers. It's some ideas that are a little bit harder and really involve sad things in life as well. But we're going to see the importance of mothers and the strength of mothers, and a little bit of mother as a metaphor as well. Um, of course, strength, we're talking about spiritual and emotional strength. Didn't look up any kind of, female weightlifters or anything, although I'm sure there are some. So we are going to be talking about, different kind of inner strength and how that can serve the individual, but most likely in this case to serve the mother's children, really, to kind of reinforce herself, but also to be a reinforcement of strength for others, an inspiration for others. So with all of that in mind, I'm gonna start us off with the share screen. Okay. Oops. Great. Here we go. Computer's acting a little funny. There we go. So, mothers and strength. So the question is, to start us off with, when we say mothers in Judaism, are we talking about all mothers, which we might to a certain extent, or are we talking about the mothers, namely the matriarchs? We're going to talk about who they are, or perhaps other mother figures in our tradition as well. We're going to really do kind of a little bit of all. Oh, I'm sorry about this. There we go. So first, let's talk about the matriarchs. I think a lot of people know about this concept of the four matriarchs. In Judaism, we have three patriarchs, four matriarchs generally. But of course, Jews being Jews, rabbis being rabbis in the Talmud, that sometimes there's some disagreement as to the actual number. Many of us know this number, especially from the famous counting song at the end of the Pesach Seder, Echad Mi Yodea, and the fourth one, who knows four? I know four. Four are the mothers. And those four mothers, or fancy word matriarchs, generally are numbered off as Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the wives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob having two wives. However, in fact, and also when we talk about the matriarchs, I think we can't shy away from, actually, in our day and age, a liturgical use as well, because of course there are actually, I don't know what they do at Adath Israel. Do you guys include the matriarch when you're saying the Amidah? I know there's certain conservative synagogues that do, that when you say like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the beginning of the Shmona Esrei of the Amidah, that also sometimes some congregations add in Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, which would be a later, very late, a kind of more of egalitarian move. I'm not sure. I think in the Siddur that you use, I think if it's a Sim Shalom, I think the option is given there. So I'm not sure what you guys do.
Anna, I can answer.
Oh, good.
The old Siddur we were using did
Right.
not. The
Yes.
new one has with without the matriarchs and with the matriarchs. The A version is without and the B is with. In Shul, they do it only with the A.
Oh.
Those of us at home can do it with the B, and that's my nickname has become 122B because I do it with the matriarch.
Oh, you're kidding. Thank you so much for sharing that, Carol. You've very much personalized it for us then. And I mean, I think that that's really interesting. You say home or not home in general. I mean, certainly there is formal structure of prayer, but the lovely thing is that, I mean, of course, not everyone would agree with that particular part, but there are plenty of portions of our prayers which are silent, which do enable us to customize to a certain extent. So it's interesting how you say it's yours rather than the shul's, but certainly there are many conservative and reform synagogues that do include the matriarchs, formally on a regular basis. Anyway, so that's generally the top list here. Then we have the second list of 6, with the addition of Bilha or Zilpa, who are the handmaids of Rebecca and Leah, who they brought into marriage with them, but are sometimes called full wives of Jacob. And we're going to see more about the children of Jacob or the children of Israel. In a minute, we'll look at a kind of a family tree, a visual to get a better understanding of that. So that would be 6. And actually, I think that there's a move, I don't think in the conservative movement, but in the reform movement, to actually include all 6 matriarchs, sometimes in the same prayer. And this is in order to kind of rehabilitate the 2 that were kind of a lower socioeconomic status, that who were also mothers of Israel, wives of Jacob, and that they should be kind of, their status should be elevated as well. So that's 6. And then we can go back to the number 4 again and talk about the matriarchs being only those, not only, but those 4 wives of Jacob. So that would be another number 4. See how it goes there? So 4 or 6 or 4. There really isn't a right answer for how many matriarchs there are. And sometimes in different contexts, we might be referring to different listings. Now, I promise you a picture. I think that's what comes next. Yes. So here we have these 4 wives of Jacob, and we see here the descendants that come from them. As you can see, the very colorful one here, Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And we can see which children came from which mother or which wife of Jacob. And we can see the relationship also of Zilpah to Leah and then Bilhah to Rachel. There's also different midrashim that want to explain them even by blood in terms of half-sisters and things like that, kind of keeping it all in the family as they often did in the book of Genesis. But here we see that just like, I mean, Leah has the most children. She's the most fertile in the story. She actually has a 7th child as well. She has the only daughter, Dinah, who's not listed here because she's not important because according to the actual text, one of the tribes does not come from her. According to certain midrashim, I think that we discussed at one point, actually, some do, but according to the actual text of the Torah, tribes don't come from that daughter and other reasons that she's not being discussed here. So Leah has all these sons. They go on to be leaders of tribes of Israel. Zilpah has 2. So you might think, oh, that's less, that she doesn't count. No, she counts. Rachel also only has 2 sons. And so Rachel counts. So you would think that Zilpah would as well. And similarly with Bilhah, 2 sons. So I wanted to talk to you about this 4 because of a special tradition that is connected with them. And that is this concept here of, I hope you can see, I think there's some gray boxes masking my slides. I hope you can see it. At the top, I have a Hebrew word here spelled out in English letters, and the word is barzel, and it means iron. And I think there's some translations that give a different name of a different metal, but whatever it is, it's always considered a very, very strong metal, and it is a symbol of strength. Now, if you put together that second list of four, the four wives of Jacob, you will see Bilha, Rachel, Zilpah, and Leah. See the parts that I highlighted in red. Brrrl. If you put those words in Hebrew, as you know, the Hebrew vowels are missing from the consonants. Those are the little dots and lines that go underneath. So if we have these four consonants, you could put in some vowels and it turns to barzel. And the idea is here that there's a certain iron strength when you think about these four mothers together, who after all are the mothers of the tribes of Israel, otherwise known as the mothers of the children of Israel, otherwise known as us. That the mothers, especially when they're together, are a symbol of strength. Now, mothers and strength, actually, this was the idea that I was thinking about when I first conceived of today's lesson. I really love this idea, and it really gets taken a little bit further, at least in the Middle Ages. It's not clear if it's before then, but at least in the Middle Ages. And let me show you how. The protective measures of iron was also popular, this is part of a longer discussion in an article, was also popular throughout the Middle Ages. Iron was used by women in connection with childbirth. So not a surprise, I think, to us, hopefully, that the idea of childbirth in ancient and medieval times, of course, and even in some parts of the world today, was considered a very, very dangerous time for children as well as for mothers, the high rate of maternal death, etc. And so a lot of special prayers, but also superstitions, kind of folk magic, perhaps, grew up surrounding the idea of the giving protection during birth and just before and just after birth. And so this concept of iron and was connected with childbirth as a way of helping. And how did they do this? An iron knife was often left under the pillow of the woman in childbirth, and postpartum women would walk around their homes with such a knife, sounds scary, to ward off evil spirits. They explained that the iron, barzel, as we've been talking about, was protective because it was an acronym for those four wives, Bilha, Rachel, Zilpah, and Leah, the four wives of Jacob. So something about the merit of those four mothers together, joined together, can be seen as a strengthening for these new mothers. Now, is this a superstition? Is it a folk belief? Yes, probably it is. But nevertheless, I think it's also very interesting that the tie in to the to these particular mothers, and that when they're all together, I like that when they're all together as opposed to individual, when they're all together, that they're a symbol of strength. And quite frankly, the concept of, not the concept, but iron itself apparently was used in other religions as well, as part of their folklore and kind of superstitions and amulets to serve as protection. So the concept of iron, and I guess the strength that it symbolizes, is not unique to Judaism, but the idea of tying in the concept of iron and the togetherness of these biblical mothers as being strength and strengthening for women in need, I think is a very beautiful idea. Okay, this playing around with letters in general, I mean, it sounds a little bit foreign to our ears, but in fact, for the ancient rabbis, it was a very standard way of interpreting biblical texts, to use acronyms and find patterns in letters and things like that. All right, so that was my first thought about mothers and strength, that particular idea, and I'm happy to share it with you. But then I also have a certain fascination with this concept of mothers giving sustenance. Now, of course, I'm going to start with a caveat here. We're about to talk about a very vital biological function, namely breastfeeding. Sometimes in the text here it's called nursing, but I tend to use the word breastfeeding. And what we're talking about here is an ancient form of sustaining, life-giving to newborn infants and to small children that only mothers were able to provide. Of course, I know that nowadays there are many people that for health and other reasons choose to sustain their babies using formula, etc. I'm not passing judgment on those women, but of course, in ancient times, there was no such thing as formula. So breastfeeding in any manner, shape, or form, and we're going to see different ideas about it, was vital, was absolutely essential in terms of providing sustenance, strength, and life for all newborns. Okay, so this is, I think, an amazing idea about motherhood and strength. So we're going to see some ideas from our tradition about this. The first one has to do with Sarah. Now this is, first of all, before I even get to Sarah, I have to tell you, sometimes I bring in images to, some paintings and whatever in order to demonstrate some of the ideas that we have. I didn't find any today. I don't think. I didn't find any that were really going to help us. But the concept of the symbolism and importance of mothers and breastfeeding as being spiritual is certainly something you can find all over classical painting because, of course, Mary breastfed Jesus, and it is a very, very common motif in painting. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. So there's plenty of that. Couldn't find any of our Jewish ideas that we're talking about, but I think it's a very interesting idea to be thinking about the importance and holiness in Christianity that we so associate with Christianity, of that special relationship of Mary, the Madonna, to the baby Jesus, and that can be, I think, very moving for some mothers. And I kind of like the idea that in Judaism, we have some of those ideas as well. All right, now let's get back to Judaism. We're going to get to kind of unusual midrash. Actually, I would say a very unusual midrash. At this point in the story of Abraham and Sarah, that Abraham and Sarah were, told that they were going to have a child after so many years, even though Sarah was already very, very old. And it certainly, past the time that it would be kind of normal or natural for a woman to have a baby. And so as part of her shock and not even understanding of how this could happen. Obviously, the answer is that it's a miracle, but that she couldn't really conceptualize it. She basically says, who would have ever thought that to say something to Abraham that his wife Sarah would give children, would be able to breastfeed children, because something just kind of outside of her frame of reference for such an old woman. And the Midrash expands on that story for us. And it says, our mother Sarah was extremely modest. So maybe she was saying modest in terms of well, I couldn't possibly breastfeed. No, it actually goes a little further than that. Her husband Abraham said to her, this is not the time for modesty. Okay, a miracle is supposed to happen, but rather uncover your breasts so that all may know that the Holy One, blessed be He, has begun to perform miracles. Remember, it's terribly important at this stage in the game for Judaism to demonstrate to the world who God is, because Abraham is the first person to have a direct relationship with God that later, evolved into Judaism. And so at this, I guess, key juncture, it's important to demonstrate everything that God can do. And apparently, according to this midrash, it's not in the Torah itself, that a miracle occurred. She uncovered her breasts, and the milk gushed forth from them as two fountains. I really wanted to find a painting of this, but I don't think it exists. And noble ladies, not just anyone, but the fancy women, of course, they weren't Jews because there were no other Jews at this point. Abraham and Sarah were the first ones. But other noble ladies came and had their children suckled by her, saying, okay, of course, the concept of wet nurses and other women breastfeeding for other women was a natural thing that happened in the time before bottles and formulas. We'll see, because this is the only way to give life to and nourishment and sustenance to babies. But these women also were very humble and modest, I guess, when they said, well, we don't merit that our children should be suckled by the milk of that righteous woman. There was some kind of acknowledgement that Sarah was a righteous woman, and that these women were very honored to be able to bring their babies to breastfeed from her. And so then there's a comment by the rabbis about this. I mean, I'm just trying to picture it. It seems like quite an event. But then the rabbis go on to comment further about who were these women that brought their babies to experience this miracle. And it says, the rabbi said, whoever came for the sake of heaven became God-fearing. That if they came, I don't know, I guess for the sake of just feeding their babies, that was one thing. But sometimes there was an acknowledgement, a realization that, in fact, this was a miracle. And we'll see this life-giving force of breast milk. We'll see it come up more than once as being some kind of a way of transmitting Torah as well. Life and Torah, the Torah is a tree of life that we are supposed to hang on to, a time he. So, milk, breast milk to a baby is life as well. So you can begin to see where these ideas are connected. So apparently, if they were coming for the right reason, that these women and presumably their babies, their families became God-fearing, that these were part of the converts to the new religion that Abraham and Sarah were so known for inviting into Judaism and introducing Judaism to. But then there's one other rabbi that says, even when he did not come for the sake of heaven, was given greatness in this world. Well, some people might have just come from the spectacle, or just because they wanted to give milk to their baby, not because they realized it was a miracle. And then they even merited greatness in this world. The idea is that if you came with the bigger intention of doing it for the sake of heaven, and you became God-fearing and Jewish because of it, then also you would receive greatness in the world to come in heaven. So, fabulous miracle here, life-sustaining, religion transmitting, Torah transmitting through this spectacular miracle, really. I mean, it's a spectacular in that it's somewhat of a spectacle. But this was a time, I mean, of course, this is only a midrash, it's not in the Bible itself, but it's really a way of showing, the miraculousness and life-givingness of Torah, and of understanding and believing in the true one God. And it all comes directly from Sarah and from her most motherliness, that is her breast milk. All right, more stories about breast milk. This one I think is very well known, about Yocheved, Moses's mother, because of course its root is in the Bible itself. When Moses sends her baby Moses in the tiny ark down the Nile River to save him from Pharaoh's decree of killing all of the newborn baby Jewish boys, and Miriam watches over the baby. And then when Pharaoh's daughter goes to pick up the child, and Miriam then intercedes and says, shall I go and call you a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you? Right? And this actually means breastfeed, of course. This isn't like when you tell the story to little kids, there's often like a picture of, anachronistically, a picture of a nurse, like in a little white uniform. But if this is the idea, this child needs to survive and needs sustenance, food, strength to survive. No formula, no bottles. You need to have a wet nurse for this. And so she jumps in and offers up a particular Hebrew woman, namely her mother, the baby's child, although she doesn't admit this, of course, to Pharaoh's daughter, in order to sustain the baby who Pharaoh's daughter, who has now decided to raise as her own. That's the story as it is in the Torah, but there's a midrash here that kind of squishes in another story into the middle of that story. Let's see how that works. This teaches that prior to this, they had taken Moses around to all the Egyptian women, and he did not nurse. Okay, the idea is here there's a special Hebrew nurse that needs to happen here, and it needs to be special and unique because even though it's not the midrash kind of lengthens the biblical story. It happens all immediately in the Bible itself, but there's a kind of a time gap added in. I guess that's what you would call it in the story in the midrash, where the baby is the Pharaoh's daughter tries to get these wet nurses for the baby and fails. The baby does not latch on, does not take the milk. And so the idea is the baby will not survive. It needs strength from a mother, the correct mother. And so that's why this another one is offered, namely from the Hebrew women. And why is this so important? Well, this is again, the story is a little bit fantastical here, but baby Moses, allegedly, according to the rabbi, said, a mouth that in the future will speak with God should nurse something impure, that is from an Egyptian, and that this is as it is written. Here's Moses, quoting Torah that hasn't been written yet. Whom shall one teach knowledge, and whom shall one make understand the message? And the rabbis and the Midrash explain what's going on here. To whom shall God teach the knowledge of the Torah? And to whom shall God make to understand the message of the Torah, right? It's Moses, obviously, is the first one that God teaches Torah to and gives Moses the understanding of the Torah. And it says, who is it? And apparently in the prophet Isaiah, obviously using a metaphor here, says that the person who is appropriate to receive the Torah and to teach the Torah is one who is weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. Well, of course, every human at that time would have been breastfed. So what's so special about it? I mean, I guess the idea is it's the text, if you look at it in the Hebrew, is emphasizing a specific episode of milk, a special kind of milk, a special kind of breast. Who would that be other than Moses' actual mother, namely Yocheved? Now, the interesting thing to me here is there isn't a direct connection here as much, I don't think, between the actual milk and Torah itself. Although, I mean, I've always understood this idea of when Moses goes back to live with his parents for a few years until he is weaned, presumably around the age 3 in biblical times. This, everyone knows, a very vital time for child development when Moses is not living in the palace, but instead he's living with his Israelite Jewish mother and parents. And so not only is being breastfed there, but is being raised in an important way that obviously made an impression on him, even though he then went on, even if subconsciously, to go on to become the Prince of Egypt afterwards. All right, now we have a little bit more breastfeeding stories. This one, we talked about two very famous women, two very famous mothers, and now we have something of an anomaly. I'm not sure how much we can learn from it, but I could not teach this one because it's a little bit crazy and I kind of love it. So we have a interesting text from the book of Esther, from Megillat Esther, the story of Purim, that describes this very interesting relationship between Esther and Mordecai, which we can talk about that another time. But Esther has a Hebrew name, as you hopefully know. Her name is Hadassah, and she is an orphan. And so Mordecai does have a familial relationship to her and ends up raising her as his own daughter. The Hebrew word here that he brought up, Hadassah, it's Oman at Hadassah, is an unusual word. And it makes the rabbis think that, in fact, Mordecai fed and sustained her, right? Gave her strength, gave her physical strength, enabled her to survive. And the assumption here is that when he adopted her as his own daughter, that she was still an infant in need of breast milk. It doesn't say that he hired a wet nurse for her, which would have been standard for, this kind of motherless family, but it says that he took care of it himself. And so let's see what it says. Says Rabbi Yudan in the Midrash, on one occasion, Mordecai, went around to all the wet nurses, but could not find one for Esther. Thereupon he suckled her himself. So very interesting in terms of all kinds of interest in Judaism nowadays, in terms of gender bending and gender fluidity and definitions of bodies and self. But the idea is here that apparently Mordecai breastfed Esther. Rabbi Brechia and Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Elazar's name said, milk actually came to him and he suckled her. When Rabbi Abahu taught this publicly, the congregation laughed, as I'm hoping you did, or maybe you groaned, or maybe you were disgusted. I'm not sure. And because it certainly does not seem natural to us. Interestingly, a Mishnah is brought here to prove that something that we now know scientifically. He said to them, yet is it not a Mishnah? Because in Mishnah Machshirin 6:7, Rabbi Shimon Elazar says in that Mishnah, the milk of a male is ritually clean. In a complete different discussion talking about liquids that are ritually clean or not, it mentions the milk that comes from a male. And apparently there are conditions, usually having to do with disturbances in the hormonal system, that would enable men to breastfeed. There's fancy scientific names for it. I haven't brought them for you. I don't remember them. But apparently that physiologically this is not at all common, but apparently it sometimes does happen. Enough so that it was even dealt with in the Mishnah in terms of, is that milk ritually clean or not? So again, I don't know the idea here. I mean, I think perhaps we're talking about mothers and strength. We do not have a mother here. We have a mother stand-in, but we do have the idea of feeding and sustaining and the strengthening of a bond between the mother substitute in this case. So necessary, even so much so that a male can breastfeed. So this bond between Mordecai and Esther. Now, one more about breastfeeding, and then we'll move on to other things. I have two question marks up here at the top where it says Moses or God, because we have a rhetorical question. Oh my, I'm running late. Rhetorical question here from Moses, actually. After one of the times the Jewish people, more than once, but after one time when they were complaining in the desert of not having enough food, not having enough meat, actually, Moses is then complaining to God about how and kind of in a despair in terms of how to handle the situation. And at that point he says, did I conceive all these people? Like Moses is saying, why is all this coming to me? Why do I have to receive all these complaints? Did I bear them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant? Okay, to the land that you've promised them. So in this case, it's Moses actually saying, like, you're making me feel like a breastfeeding mother with all of the intensity that and hard work that entails, because you're not helping me when these people are complaining to me and I'm taking it all upon myself. So it's Moses saying that, but I think in a way he might be inferring that, like, God, you're the one that should be taking these complaints. It's not like I can't feed them, you, God, have to feed them. So I'm not like the breastfeeder who needs to breastfeed them. You, God, should be the one breastfeeding them. Okay, it's a lot of breastfeeding. We have other stuff to do, but I guess we will stop now and take some questions.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. One question, I gotta get back down to the questions here. Beverly asked, what other people were around when Sarah uncovered her breast?
Oh, so at that time, the Jewish people, I think it's traditionally believed to be 10 generations between Noah's time and Abraham's time. So this is according to the Bible. We're not doing history here. We're doing, biblical ideas. But from biblical ideas, we would have had at Noah's time, the whole world destroyed except for Noah and his family with the flood. After the flood, Noah and his family, and presume like that they then grew and expanded for 10 generations, and that all those people would have been around in the earth. So a lot, but don't ask me how many.
So then you said when Sarah, when she uncovered her breast, and the other non-Jews, they were the only Jews.
That's right.
So they were the only Jews in that location
They were the only Jews in the world.
in the world. And that
In the
was
world.
before Noah.
No, it's after Noah, 10 generations after Noah.
Okay, so 10 generations
Abraham
after
is the
Noah.
first-
But
right,
Noah,
Abraham is the first Jew.
right. And so Noah wasn't a Jew.
Correct.
Okay. So how did, that's another whole story.
We can talk about that another time.
Another time.
The idea of God, being the creator of the world and had some kind of relationship with other people before Abraham certainly exists in Judaism, but the idea of the covenant, of the understanding of the special relationship of one group that would all come from Abraham and Sarah, starts with Abraham and Sarah.
Okay. There were other people on the earth. They were the first.
Yes, who are also created by God and all have somewhat of a relationship with God, but not the special covenant that would become the Jewish people.
Got it. Understand. Thank you.
And there was another comment by Bernard talking about the iron and the strength. And he said there's an extremely high award medal given by the Kaiser in World War I was the Iron Cross.
I said it definitely exists in other cultures, religions, in terms of as a symbol of strength that like this obviously is, I'm assuming. And also I think a symbol of war too, because the idea of, I imagine, like other things of war, other utensils of war, before guns and wood and gunpowder was introduced in the West, that you would need things that were physically strong in order to protect yourself or to injure other people. So I think iron was considered, one of the best things for them.
All right. And
Okay.
now let's go back to.
Let's go back.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna speed us up and back to share screen. So we have a lot of words as usual. Sometimes I'll be doing some summaries in the interest of time. Okay, so mothers as advocates. Here we have mothers needing to be strong in order to advocate for their children. Now, I'm a high school teacher, so I know about this concept of helicopter parenting. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the idea is that sometimes mothers can come in, and even fathers too, very strong. Nowadays, a little bit more so than a few decades ago, and be advocates for their children. Why didn't my kid get, an A+ on this? Or why are you treating my kid that way, rather than letting kids take care of it themselves? So sometimes it's a little bit unusual in the high school years, but certainly for young children. They need their mothers. They need their mothers to advocate for them. They need their mothers to protect them. And I think that kind of need sometimes carries over, sometimes perhaps not as appropriately, but sometimes very appropriately into future life as well. And we have a very important example of this in Judaism with one of the matriarchs, actually, who we discussed. We're going to talk about it in a little different way now, namely the matriarch Rachel, okay, or Rachel in Hebrew. So, I'm not going to share this whole story in the interest of time. I will summarize it for you. It's found here in well, I'll share the introduction with you. That it's from Midrash Eicha Rabbah, that's associated with the holiday of Tisha B'Av. Sad times for the Jewish people. And there's an introduction here where it says, he, Moses in heaven, spoke before God. God, we're talking about mothers being an advocate, but of course, God, Moses, who shepherded us through the desert and as a leader, took care of us. You could say that's kind of motherly as well. And he needed strength to do that. He also advocated for us in heaven. But it's a very interesting concept here. Sovereign of the universe, you have written in your Torah, whether it be a cow or a ewe, a mother sheep, you shall not kill it and its young in one day, right? This is the main, you should not kill a baby kid in its mother's milk, the main locus for our understanding of not mixing meat and milk together in kashrut. What Moses here is accusing God, though, of allowing so many times in Jewish history for mothers and sons to be killed on the same day. The horrible things, travesties in Jewish history, when whole families are killed and martyred. Of course, we think about the Holocaust, but all the way through Jewish history. And the idea is here, God, you've given us this rule not to kill a baby goat in its mother's milk. How is it that you have allowed throughout our history to allow mothers and sons and children to be killed on the same day or together and remain silent about it? So this kind of is a pretty heavy idea about mothers, but it kind of leads into this concept of our matriarch Rachel. Now, our matriarch Rachel, I'm going to skip this whole part of the Midrash. It's a whole thing talking about the relationship to Leia, that of course that Jacob is supposed to marry Rachel first, and then Rachel and Leia, who are sisters, are tricks Jacob into marrying Leia first. And this Midrash talks about that idea a little bit, or actually it expands on it a lot. So I'm skipping it, but I'm saying it talks a little bit about the concept of jealousy. That's important. Not a surprise in general. Anyone that has a sister or has daughters knows that sometimes there'll be jealousy between daughters. But this one in particular, where the Midrash before explains that Rachel was able to overcome her jealousy of Leah, who was getting her husband first, and even was able to overcome her jealousy, okay, of her sister. And then it goes on and says, and if I, a creature of flesh and blood, formed of dust and ashes, was not envious of my rival sister, and did not expose her to shame and contempt, like, on the wedding night, and say to Jacob, you're marrying the wrong girl. Why should you, a king who lives eternally and are merciful, so much more so than just little old human me, be jealous of idolatry in which there's no reality? Okay, it's an interesting concept in general. We all know that idolatry is forbidden in Judaism. What you may not know is that one of the 3 reasons that the rabbis believe that the first temple was destroyed was because of actual idolatry in the temple. And what she's saying here is basically, God, what do you care about idolatry? It's all fake anyway, a few stones. Don't be jealous of that and punish so terribly your people, my children, because of idolatry. Because if, I was jealous, but I could get over it. God, you should get over it too. But instead you don't. You let that jealousy take over and you punished my children. Remember, Rachel here is seen as now you'll begin to see mother to us all. She's only one of the wives of Jacob, only one of the 4 mothers of the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, but she kind of takes us all on. We'll see in a minute. And their enemies have done with them as they wish. Namely, God, you allowed them all to be exiled and punished and even killed as part of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, because you couldn't get over your jealousy. I got over mine. Please, please, God, have mercy on them. This is mother as advocate. I as my mother in my sense as a sister, but we'll see it takes over in terms of mother as well. I feel for them. Please, please protect them, or please restore them. Therefore, the mercy of the Holy One, blessed be He, was stirred, and He said, for your sake, Rachel, I will restore Israel to their place eventually when we return them from exile and build the second temple, which happened historically 70 years later. Let's just see if that more idea developed. She's not really emphasized, as a mother there, but she does when this part of the same story is kind of retold by the prophet Jeremiah. So it is written, so says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, kol nishma b'Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. So the idea is here that Rachel is weeping, according to the prophet Jeremiah, because she is pleading for her children to be returned to their borders. They are in exile, and she is pleading for them as a mother would plead for her own children to return. For the return to happen to the land of Israel. This is tied up with the concept that, of course, some of you would have heard of about the holiness of the tomb of Rachel. This is what it looks like today. So some of you might have heard some of these words before. They're very famous because they're part of the Haftorah of the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And I've taken for you from the Hertz Chumash commentary this concept, this explanation that kind of ties a lot of these ideas together. Rachel is known for weeping for her children. She's asking God to be good to the children, to not be jealous of other gods like she wasn't jealous, and just to protect children. She has a special connection to children because she had so longed for children as to regard herself as dead without them. That's how she explained herself to her husband Jacob when Leia was able to conceive successfully and she initially was not. And so she has a special feeling and special connection to children, and now weeps that they, or the children of Israel, are no more. They are slain or driven into exile. That's how it's described in the book of Jeremiah, where this is from. According to an ancient Jewish legend, Jacob intentionally buried her there by the roadside. All the other matriarchs and patriarchs are buried together in Marat HaMachpelah, but she is buried someplace else. And in the Bible, it's described that she was by the roadside, which on one hand does not sound very respectful. But according to a prophecy, it says, because he foresaw that his descendants would one day pass by that road on their way to exile as they were being punished by God and exiled from the land of Israel. And she would, as the mother of us all, be able to weep, and her tears would be an intercession to God to allow us to survive. Yes, we would be exiled. Yes, many of us would die, but the idea is that we would be reborn. Her voice is heard on high. The idea is here, according to Rashi, that those tears and those cries really did go up to heaven. And so the idea as a mother, this particular mother, but is being a special advocate for the children of Israel as a way of protecting us because of her tears, because of her cries, because of her experience as a mother, as a wanting to be a mother initially, and as a sister. All of this should serve as a way of protection for all of us, and that God should listen to Rachel. And of course, the tomb nowadays has taken on all kinds of mystical, and since medieval times at least, mystical qualities attached to it as well, that people feel that their prayers are answered there, especially, etc. All right. Mothers as self-sacrifice. I'm going to watch the time. So mothers as self-sacrifice. This is a heavy one. Some of you might have thought of this initially because when we talk about mothers in Judaism, sometimes mothers and children, you might have remembered the story that you were told maybe as children about Hannah and her 7 sons, or the mother and her 7 sons, often associated with the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, of course, we have concept of mothers as self-sacrifices. We have other self-sacrifices in Judaism as well. But again, through so many times of hardship, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, crusades, and otherwise, that we do have many examples, unfortunately, where mothers did sacrifice themselves for the sake of their children. So one example of that, or to a certain extent, of the concept of self-sacrifice, not exactly in the same way. I wanted to share with you the ending of this story, but just to remind you what the story is. the mother of 7 sons. Sometimes her name is called Hannah, sometimes it's Miriam. There's different versions of it in different stories. But it's also found not only in rabbinic texts, but in the book of Maccabees. A story is told of a nameless mother of 7 who was arrested with her sons for defying the decree of the Seleucid monarch Antiochus to transgress the commandments of the Torah. They did not, they refused to, they wanted to keep the mitzvot. They didn't transgress them. Refusing to capitulate to the king's demands, the sons were tortured to death one by one. The king said, bow down to this idol, and they refused to, and he gave different reasons why, and each one was then killed. Instead of persuading them to desist, their mother, who was looking on this whole time, encouraged them to die for their belief. So this idea is the mother here is not acting as self-sacrifice, but she is involved in this concept of martyrdom, and she's an inspiration in terms of martyrdom. Very hard for us to understand, but was actually reality in many times, sad to say, but true in different sad times in Jewish history. So the version of the story that we have in the Talmud ends this way. As they were taking him, the youngest of the 7 sons, to be killed, his mother said to him, "Give him to me so that I may give him a small kiss." But it was really a trick. She wanted to talk to him privately. She said to him, "My son, go and say to your father Abraham." Okay? She said basically, you're going up to heaven. And when you're up in heaven, you're going to see our father Abraham Avinu. And say to him, "You bound one son to the altar," the famous story of Akedah Yitzchak, where Abraham was supposed to bring up Isaac to sacrifice him on the altar, but then brought him down alive, didn't actually take his life. She says to her son to tell Abraham in heaven, "But I bound 7 altars." So she said, you, Abraham, did something amazing by participating in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac to demonstrate your faith to God. But look how much more I did. I actually bound 7 altars. Not really, but she led 7 sons to actual death. She too, in the end, did not survive. She, according to this version of the story, there's different versions, she went up to the roof, fell, and died, which is really just a nicer way of saying committing suicide. And at that time, a divine voice emerged and said, in a horrible way, in an awful way, meaning filled with awe, "A joyful mother of children." The idea is here that this was the ultimate martyrdom, self-sacrifice, that she led her necessarily in this horrific time of war. She led her 7 sons to do the right thing, the righteous thing, and not necessarily right, but the righteous thing, by allowing themselves to be killed al kiddush Hashem, and for the name of God, for the grace of God, and then she joined them in death, and her suicide was considered a type of martyrdom as well. So I think that we really have to pay tribute to all the mothers who were involved in a concept of self-sacrifice in Judaism. Believe me, not because they want to, but because they were thrust into such a situation that they felt that this was the correct and righteous thing to do. Mothers as metaphor. I had to leave on a slightly higher note, so I'm just going to do this. And I'm sorry, take an extra few minutes. First of all, this idea, well, actually, no, I'm skipping this because I don't have enough time. Mother's metaphor. I mentioned before this idea of breast milk perhaps having to do with Torah and God and living and sustenance. And here, actually, we have a midrash that talks about the Torah actually being our mother. So when when Israel disregards the commandments, it is as if they curse their parents, like they've broken the 10 commandments, because for God is our Father. We've all heard that metaphor before, for as it says in many places, of course, but it gives a quotation here from the book of Isaiah. But then also, it explains here, and the Torah is our mother. For it says, "And forsake not the Torah of thy mother." It's a little bit convoluted as to how that actually proves it, but I like the metaphor anyway. It continues and says, "She reared us," our mother, "she reared us," the Torah. Of course, don't forget, the word Torah is a feminine noun in Hebrew. So she, the Torah, or she, our mother, reared us at Sinai, as it says, "I have taught you in the ways of wisdom. So the idea is here, all of these verbs and nouns are all like in the feminine form. And so the idea of wisdom here and being Torah is like our mother. So we have this wonderful connection of God and Torah, or our mother and father, to sustain us and give us strength, and that we need both. One last one about strength for sure, and this one is really interesting. There's two verses from the book of Isaiah beside each other that talk about, describe God. Of course, we can never fully understand what God looks like or anything like that. We have all kinds of poetic ways of referencing God. Sometimes there are ways that sound very maternal in a way, that God protects us and sustains us. And sometimes talks about God fighting for us. So here we have, the Lord goes forth like a warrior, like a fighter. He whips up his rage. He yells, he roars aloud. He charges upon his enemies. Very masculine. And then, but I don't know what masculine and feminine is, because the next line says, I have kept silent too long, kept still and restrained myself. Here is God talking about God's self. Now I will scream like a woman in labor. I will pant and I will gasp. So this is God fighting to do the right thing, to help us do the right thing, with two wonderful metaphors side by side. One screaming like a military fighter to do the right thing, and the other screaming like a woman in labor to do the right thing. I'm sorry for going a little over time. Any questions?
Okay, I don't have any questions. I'm looking to see. If anybody has one, put your hand up and we'll try to answer you that way. But I don't. I think we're all digesting.
It's a lot. I can just sum up a little bit. The idea is, this wasn't your, Hallmark card, mother being a bouquet of roses and I love you, mom, although that's great also. This was the hard work of motherhood, that you need strength for, and that is necessary for the strengthening of the child, which is really the strengthening of the future of the human race, right? And so the strength of doing all of this hard work is described in these ways in very particular, I tried to emphasize, all kinds of strength is important, right? And necessary. But I think this was special kind of strength that is exhibited by, by our mothers, our matriarchs, and by different metaphors. And I hope that they can help give strength to all of us.
I do have one question just jumped in here from
Please.
Robin. Did Jacob have actual marriage ceremonies with Bilpa and Silva, or was it part of the weddings
Right.
to Leia and Rachel?
So I am trying to think about the actual ceremonies, not described in the Bible, but in terms of the language of acquiring a wife, I don't think is even used in any of those contexts either. But I think that those stories are quite extensive. All those stories about Jacob and his sons, there's lots of chapters there. And I think that actually we have the language of handmaiden and the language of actual wife used to describe those two women. So I don't think we have marriages, but I think we have titles that would convey that. That being said, though, as I said, we talked about right in the very beginning, this concept of who counts as the matriarchs, that very often they aren't included. So it's like a lot of things in Judaism, we have different opinions, and there are different ideas that tend to go in and out of favor. As I said, there's, I think, this movement more in the reform movement than the conservative movement to help rehabilitate Bilha and Zilpah, not only because they are also mothers of Israel, and their children go on to be, tribes, but in order to teach a certain lesson about not ignoring women who might be of a different socioeconomic class if they also played an important role as well. So if they are handmaids as well as wives, let's not ignore them. Let's elevate them as we should, all people, no matter their titles, when they do important things.
Thank you. Anna, that was wonderful. And next week is our last one, Bruria, Ancient Talmud Scholar. So that one should
Right.
be an interesting one.
Yes.
So I
Very
encourage,
different, but hopefully
yeah,
very interesting.
good. Encourage everyone to come back for that one. It's our last one, and we'll see. I know it's been good. We'll give you a little bit of a break, Anna, and maybe we'll do some brainstorming and see what we can do next. If anybody has ideas, please send them in to us.
Yeah.
To go. I know I want to continue learning, so we'll see. And then just a plug for another course, just a one-time one. On Thursday, May 13th from 1 to 2, we have Marcia Fenwick, who is a nutritionist, and the title is How to Have Your Cake and Eat It Too. And you register for it the same way, in our the Adath website. So thank everyone for coming, and Anna, have a good rest, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you next week.
You all there.
All righty, thank you. Bye-bye.